The quantum spurs on my boots left trails of blue fire across the training hall floor as I executed the march again. 17 steps, each one precisely placed in the traditional knight formation. I was sweating and frustrated as Instructor Lawson shook his head. "Again, Lynch. Your 5th step is still hesitating. The quantum matrix can't establish a proper flow if you're second-guessing yourself." I nodded, pushing damp hair from my forehead. "Yes, sir. 24 years old, top of my class at the academy, and still stumbling over basic maneuvers like a first-year cadet." I reset my position, focusing on the feeling of the quantum spurs against the training room floor. They hummed with barely contained energy, responding to my movements, my intentions, my will. "Remember," Lawson said, his voice softening slightly, "the spurs don't just follow your feet, they follow your conviction. You're thinking too much about the pattern and not enough about why you're making it." Why I was making it. That was always the sticking point. Why was I here, in this uniform, with these quantum spurs, leaving trails of blue fire in my wake? The answer came unbidden. 3,082,907. The number of shots fired in salute on that gray day 16 years ago. The day we buried my father, or rather buried the idea of him, since there was no body to recover from the forge interior. I pushed the thought away and reset my stance. 17 steps. A disciplined march that instilled the precision and focus a knight needed. That was reason enough. This time, I moved with purpose, letting muscle memory guide me rather than conscious thought. The quantum spurs flared brighter, the blue trails forming steady, uniform lines that lingered in the air longer than they should have, defying conventional physics as only knight technology could. When I finished, Instructor Lawson nodded once. "Better, much better," he checked his datapad. "That's enough for today. Historical Contexts seminar begins in 20 minutes. Don't be late. Professor White doesn't tolerate tardiness, not even from his star pupil." I acknowledged the instruction with a respectful inclination of my head, then made my way to the locker room. My fellow cadets were already changing, their conversations a mix of technical discussions about quantum harmonics and the usual banter. "Lynch," called Casa as I entered. "Tell Williams here that the Santiago slip isn't just a myth. You've seen the historical records." I smiled despite my exhaustion. The Santiago slip is documented in at least 3 battle accounts from the First Distortion War, though there's debate about whether it was actually physically possible or if the sensor readings were corrupted. As I changed into my academy uniform, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror. The Lynch looking back at me wasn't the scared 8-year-old boy who'd watched his father's memorial from an apartment window, nor the impulsive teenager who'd blurted out his ambitions to Colonel Caldwell at the Remembrance Fields. I'd grown into my father's features. The same strong jawline, the same serious eyes, but where he'd worn colonial marine insignia, I wore the cadet emblem of the Texas Knight Academy. Professor White was already at the lectern when I arrived, his sharp eyes tracking each student as we filed in. His prosthetic leg gleamed under the classroom lights, a reminder of his service in the Proxima conflicts, before the Distortion War. He was no less formidable for his injury, and there was a gravity to his presence that commanded respect. His right hand rested on the hilt of his family's sword, a habit rather than a threat, though rumor held he could still execute a perfect San Jacintus special if the situation demanded it. "Today," he began without preamble as the last student settled, "we continue our examination of the evolution of human warfare, focusing on the philosophical shift that occurred with the formation of the Texas Knights." The holographic display behind him activated, showing footage I recognized immediately. The Battle of New Montana, where the Knights had first demonstrated the full potential of quantum harmonics against the Distortion fleet. The images still took my breath away. Ships moving in patterns that shouldn't have been possible. Energy trails creating complex lattices across the vacuum. The Distortion craft retreating in what analysts later termed tactical confusion. "The conventional understanding," Professor White continued, "is that the Knights represented a technological revolution in warfare. This is at best incomplete. At worst, it fundamentally misunderstands what the first knights actually accomplished. He paced in front of the display, his gait measured, precise despite his prosthetic leg, the movements of someone who had internalized knight disciplines through years of combat experience. Yes, the quantum spurs, the modified energy blades, the harmonic disruption fields, these were technological innovations. But they were symptoms, not causes. The true revolution was philosophical. With a gesture, he changed the display to show a timeline of human warfare from ancient conflicts through the Distortion War. Throughout human history, warfare has evolved along predictable lines. Technological advances drive tactical innovations, which in turn spur new technologies. It's a feedback loop that has defined human conflict since the first stone tools. The Colonial Marine Corps, the Orbital Guard, the New Europa Defense Force, all operated within this paradigm. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. The Texas Knights broke it, not through superior technology, though that certainly played a role, but through a fundamental shift in how they conceptualized conflict itself. The display changed again, showing Colonel James Walker, the first Knight commander, addressing his troops before the Battle of Warren Prime. The footage was grainy, the audio distorted, but his words came through clearly. "Way I see it, them machines are trying to solve an equation. Our job isn't to be a better equation, it's to be a poem they can't translate." Professor White nodded, as if Walker had just provided the perfect punctuation to his point. This is the core of Knight philosophy. We don't seek to outmatch our opponents within their own paradigm. We change the paradigm itself. I found myself leaning forward, captivated despite having studied Knight history extensively. Something about the way he framed it was making connections I hadn't seen before. After class, Professor White caught my eye. "Cadet Lynch, a moment of your time, please?" I approached his desk, curious. While I was performing well in his class, he rarely singled out students for individual attention. "Your last paper on Knight aesthetics was insightful," he said, "but I noticed something in your analysis. You focused extensively on how Knight traditions serve as practical combat advantages, how the distinctive appearance creates psychological effects in opponents, how the ceremonial elements reinforce unit cohesion." He studied me for a moment. "What you didn't address was why you believe these traditions matter, not to the Knights as an organization, but to you personally." The question caught me off guard. "I'm not sure I understand, Professor." "You're top of your class, Lynch. Your technical proficiency is impressive. Your academic understanding of Knight history is comprehensive. But Instructor Lawson tells me you still hesitate on the fifth step of the traditional march." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm working on it, Professor." "I'm sure you are." His tone was merely observational. "The hesitation isn't technical, it's philosophical. You understand what the Knights are, but I'm not convinced you've fully grasped why we are." He gestured to the sword at his side. "This blade has been with me through 2 wars. The quantum matrix inside contains not just my combat experiences, but something of my essence, my conviction, my purpose. When I draw it, I'm not just accessing tactical data. I'm connecting with why I fought, why I believe the Knights are necessary." He fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "You're here because of your father, Sergeant Lynch of the Colonial Marines. There's no shame in that. Many of our finest Knights were drawn to service by personal loss. But at some point, Cadet, you need to find your own answer to the why. Not just why you're here, but why the Knights exist at all." Professor White then did something unexpected. "For your next assignment, I'd like you to focus on the Colonial Marine action at the Forge interior, specifically Penetrator Team 9's mission. My father's team. The one that never returned." "Professor, I've studied the available records," I said carefully. "There isn't much detail about what happened once they entered the Forge interior. The transmission Colonel Caldwell mentioned at the memorial was heavily corrupted." "Not all of it," he replied. "Some records remain classified even 16 years later, accessible only to senior Knights and academic researchers with specific clearance." He tapped something on his datapad. "I've just granted you access to the complete archive. I think you'll find it illuminating. The archive revealed a truth I'd never known. My father's team hadn't simply died fighting. They'd undertaken a desperate suicide mission to destroy a critical fabricator deep within the forge. Unlike the Knights with their specialized equipment and training, the colonial Marines had to rely on conventional tactics, overwhelming firepower, and sheer determination. Major Harrington's final transmission showed the team pushed far beyond what should have been possible. They'd fought their way through automated defenses and toxic environments that had claimed many lives before them. My father was visible in the background, setting charges with methodical precision despite his injuries. "Command, this is Penetrator 9 Actual," Harrington reported, blood trickling from beneath his cracked visor. "We've reached the primary fabricator node. Casualties are heavy. 7 effectives remaining." His voice was strained, each word seeming to cost him. "Standard entry points heavily defended. The only approach is through the coolant channels. Survival probability minimal." The camera shifted to my father. He glanced up briefly, his face streaked with soot and blood, but his eyes clear, determined. He was rigging the last of their heavy demolition charges. "Sir," he addressed someone off camera, "once we enter the coolant system, we'll have approximately 3 minutes before the radiation levels become lethal. That should be enough time to place the charges at the structural weak points we've identified." Another burst of static, and then Harrington was back on screen. "We understand this is a one-way mission, but if these fabricators keep producing, none of our colonies stand a chance." "Command acknowledges," came a voice from off-screen. "Penetrator 9, your sacrifice will not be forgotten." Just before they moved out, my father stepped closer to the camera. For a moment he hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice not meant for command. If this recording somehow makes it back," he said, his voice suddenly less certain than when discussing the mission parameters, "tell Ellie and Ethan I'm sorry. Tell them," he swallowed hard, "tell them I wish I could have watched them grow up. Tell Sarah I—" The transmission cut off in a final burst of static. Colonel Caldwell's after-action report filled in the rest. Penetrator Team 9 successfully breached the fabricator node and detonated their charges at 3:47 hours. The resulting explosion destroyed the facility's primary production capability, creating a critical vulnerability our strike team was able to exploit in our assault on the central forge. The tactical intelligence provided by their mission and their selfless sacrifice directly enabled our eventual victory. Without their actions, it is highly doubtful our operation would have succeeded. The next morning, I faced the traditional march again. The quantum spurs on my boots hummed against the training hall floor as I prepared. 17 steps, each one precisely placed. Instructor Lawson watched from the edge of the training circle, his expression neutral. Beside him, Professor White observed with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see past surface performance to the intention beneath. I took a deep breath, centering myself. The 5th step, that was where I always hesitated, where my conviction faltered. I'd been approaching it as a technical challenge, the precise placement of my foot, the angle of my body, the distribution of weight, but that wasn't what the step was about at all. The traditional night march wasn't just a series of movements. It was a philosophy expressed through motion. Each step was a statement, an imposition of will on reality itself. The 5th step, the point where the pattern shifted from defensive to offensive posture, wasn't just a change in tactical approach. It was a declaration of intent. I began the sequence, the quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire in my wake. As I approached the 5th step, I didn't think about the technical specifications. Instead, I thought about my father in that fabricator node, moving with calm determination toward certain death. I thought about his final recorded words, that apology to his family, that unfinished message to my mother, and the courage it took to continue the mission anyway, knowing he would never come home. The quantum spurs flared brighter than I'd ever seen them, the trail of blue fire intensifying, creating a pattern that seemed to bend the light around it. There was no hesitation, no faltering, just pure, focused intent carrying through into the remainder of the sequence. When I completed the final step, the training hall was silent. I turned to face Instructor Lawson and Professor White, uncertain what their reaction would be. Lawson spoke first, his voice gruff but carrying a note of approval I'd never heard before. "Well done, cadet. That's what we've been waiting to see." Professor White's expression was more measured, but I could see something like satisfaction in his eyes. "You found your answer to the why," he said simply. "Yes, Professor," I replied. "I think I have. It wasn't just about honoring my father's memory anymore. It wasn't even about continuing his legacy. It was about understanding what he'd embodied in those final moments. That sometimes warfare demanded more than technology or tactics. Sometimes it required absolute commitment to a cause greater than yourself, the willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice without guarantee of recognition or glory. The Knights hadn't revolutionized human warfare merely by developing quantum spurs and energy blades. They'd done it by institutionalizing that same spirit of selfless courage that my father and his team had demonstrated. They'd created a framework where individual will and conviction could be amplified and focused like a weapon. And now, 16 years later, his son was continuing not just his memory, but his spirit. The quantum spurs on my boots weren't just weapons or tools. They were expressions of the same commitment that had driven my father into those coolant channels, knowing he wouldn't return. 3,082,907 shots fired in salute, and now I truly understood why they mattered, not just as an acknowledgement of sacrifice, but as recognition of the courage that had saved humanity when technology alone wasn't enough. Ready to remember the past while creating the future. Ready to be not just a weapon, but a statement. Ready to be a Texas Knight. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Video shares, memberships, and super thanks help the channel grow as well, so feel free to partner with this channel in that way as we grow. With that all said, thank you again for listening to the story, and thank you for your time. On the left side of your screen are some videos I think you might be interested in. I hope to see you in the next one.